Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Engineering Ethics webinar. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation today, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have. There will be time for discussion of questions at the end of the presentation. Looking at the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel, please note also that a copy of today's presentation is available for reference. With that, we will turn things over to Tom Pannett. Hello, Tom.
Hey, Mike, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Well, thank you for selecting me again to do this presentation. It's the third or fourth year I think I've done it for LTAP, and every year I try to make it different, and I hope it's interesting and enjoyable for the attendees. I'm going to apologize, everyone, just in case, because the IT gods at my firm have decided that phone calls need to run through Teams, and Teams is hooked up to my computer. So for any reason I get a Teams call, I'm going to be scrambling, and I'm glad you can't see my face because I'll be frustrated with it, but it is what it is. It's just one of those things with technology. You gotta love it or hate it or both. So we're not talking about technology today. We're talking about engineering ethics in 2025, and I want to share with you my research on how generational ethics and cultural ethics created the paradigm for today's engineer. I'm like the sign says, Tom Pannett. I'm with the law firm of Kegler Brown Hill Ritter here in Columbus, Ohio. Quick about me, I retired from ODOT in 2021 after over 30 years in government, working for state and local government. I'm a partner in this law firm now, and I practice what I call transportation law, which means everything to do with transportation, whether it's engineering ethics. I represent professional engineers in front of the Professional Engineers and Surveyors Board, and hopefully I'll be able to share, without disclosing too much, some of my representation in this presentation today. I also do eminent domain litigation. I work on DRBs. I do contracts, and just in essence, any other type of litigation that comes across our way. So with that, we're going to talk about engineering ethics today, not me, and we're going to talk about how, in essence, the different generations that we all know and experience, and we've heard about, right? I mean, this isn't nothing new. We've heard, all of us, about generational ethics and generations, the differences, and the fact that they're in the workforce, Gen X, Gen Z, baby boomers, etc. We know that they are diverse in their thought. And we also know that we live in a country with a lot of diverse thought in generations, diverse thought in basically your experiences, and diverse thought and culture. We are a melting pot. And because we're a melting pot in the United States, we have a lot of people from a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different cultures. And those all go into how we certainly live our daily lives, but actually how it goes into our ethics. And I'll explain that and explore that with you over the next hour. So this is our discussion topics for today. We're going to explain what engineering ethics is. We're going to break down the regulations. We're going to talk about ethical philosophy, and start with Socrates and all the way to Karl Marx and a few things in between. Generational ethics, the 5 that are currently in the workforce. And I want to explain that term workforce. Not only are they working, right? You and I, we're all working, but they're also impacting the workforce by the decisions they made, by their choices in what they buy. So you may think of Gen Z as, well, they're only 13 years old. How can they possibly be in the workforce? Well, they're consuming a lot of things, and their consumption dictates how the workforce reacts and what skills are needed in today's workforce. We're going to talk about societal ethics. We're from North America to Asia, see what nuanced differences are between those different cultures. We're going to coalesce these concepts together, then I'll summarize and have an opportunity for questions. So engineering history, just the history of engineering itself. I've done that presentation just exclusively on this topic before, but here's sort of a very, very, very quick summary of it. And the thought here is to share and ask you to think with me, and I do this with a lot of my presentations, kind of think through the nuances of what we're going to be talking about in these topics. So the history of a profession, well, what is it? Well, for us, for engineers, it was that sort of slow migration, that slow shift from basically mentorship, right? You find someone doing engineering, whether they're designing, whether they're building, way back in history, and they would hire people to help them, and they'd probably grab the ones that are either the highest level in society or the most skilled, and they would bring them along and they would mentor them and they would grow them. So this membership and this concept of engineering has grown from this sharing of technological knowledge and achievements to granting membership based on some more demanding requirements. And those two demanding requirements, and there's actually going to be a third, are occupational knowledge and professional commitment. So what is occupational knowledge? Well, that's in essence a degree in engineering, experience directly in engineering, the knowledge of your occupation that helps define what engineering is. And then the professional commitment for us as professionals, we have a commitment to follow the code of ethics. We have a commitment to share knowledge. We have a commitment to be honest brokers to our peers, to our clients, to the owners. What has been added later, right, because it wasn't always this way, was this requirement under a penalty of law. So again, my previous slide, when I was sharing this mentorship, that wasn't required by the law. But now, if you look at the revised code, by law, we have to have a degree in engineering. If you don't, or if you have maybe a master's degree in engineering, but not an undergraduate degree, that might be enough for the Professional Engineers and Surveyors Board to cite you. You have to have a commitment to ethics. Obviously, if you violate that commitment, you're going to be cited as well. But we have to do these other things under penalty of law. I don't want to sound too aggressive about it, but that's really what it is. And this other thing is continuing education, and that's why we're here. So that's engineering. Let's talk a little more about ethics. Now, ethics can be broken down, and I've talked about it over the years in different formats, different forms. But this sense of ethics makes you think about it in a different way. So ethics it's a synonym for ordinary morality. You could say you're ethical, you're moral. It's also the study of philosophy. In fact, my nephew is getting his doctorate in ethics down at the University of Cincinnati. It's a study and attempt to understand how people are moral. And that's just the name of a certain standard of conduct to govern our members, for instance, us. We are members of this group. And because we are members of this group, by virtue of being members of this group, and we choose to be members of this group, we're under a certain standard, a certain sense of ethics. Now, engineering ethics dates back to the 1700s because you can look to history and find organizations that actually talked about it. In the 1700s, John Smeaton created the Smeaton Society, and it's like the ASCE or NSPE of England, and it still exists in some form out there. It's been out there for well over 300 years. But the actual study of it, so that's just, put a pin in that engineering ethics, people talking about it, being ethical engineers, was from the 1700s. But actually the study of engineering ethics as a separate philosophy really didn't start to happen until the 1970s. What does that mean for us? That means in the history of time, that's really, really new. That's really, really fresh, especially if you even consider the history of ethics and philosophy. So for the last 55 years, that's a very rare new vintage of analysis and study. So the philosophical study of engineering ethics itself is relatively fresh. So engineering ethics, again, is many things. It's a form of applied professional ethics. I can consider it that. We also know that it's a system of moral principles. We apply that in our engineering. We have rules for that. And then there's a study of moral issues. So again, engineering ethics is definitely an amalgamation of many different things. And you can look at it and you can have a sense of it, like the previous slide shared, of different angles. So we're going to talk really today about our moral principles and how those are regulated, and those are regulated by the Professional Engineers and Surveyors Board under Chapter 4733 of Ohio Revised Code. Now, there are other code sections that are relevant to the practice of engineering in that chapter. For instance, like I said, the code requires us to have certain licensure, certain experience, certain education. But for our purposes today, we are also required to have at least 2 of our 30 continuing education hours in professional ethics or the rules relevant to the engineering practice. And those can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and there's different details. The board doesn't come out with much more explanation than that, but what it does have for us, and the board did create for us, and it gives us some parameters to put around our engineering ethics, is this: the rules. These are the rules. So these are our administrative code, chapter 4733-35 through 09 are our administrative code. These are the code rules that the board came up with that went in front of the General Assembly that you and I could have had an opportunity to comment on in a public hearing, and this is what we must follow. I want to get into those rules a little bit more details. But obviously you see the first thing is the preamble. That sets the background. Then integrity, maybe that's the most important thing other than the preamble, second only to the responsibility of the public. You can't be responsible to the public if you don't have integrity, and so on and so forth. We'll get to each section in a little bit more detail. So what is the preamble? The preamble that sets the standard for the rest of the code. It sort of lays out as a summary. I guess you could look at it that way. And our preamble states that we are to safeguard the life, health, property, and welfare of the public. That's our job. We need to put the public first. Again, I've said this before, I'll say it again. We are unique in the professional world that way. Lawyers put the clients first. Doctors put the patients first. Engineers put the public first. We have to have integrity. We have to act with complete integrity. The code says we act with complete integrity and act as an honest, impartial, and faithful agent to the employer. And then we serve the public with devotion. When you're someone's agent, you act in their stead, and the faithful agent is basically someone can count on you 100%, always look out for their best interests. That's what it means to have integrity as a professional engineer for your employer. When you serve the public with devotion, that devotion is a very strong word. It means that you're devout, you're devoted to the decisions that you make are putting the public first. Those are high bars. We have a responsibility to the public as well, separately under 03. We need to protect the public, but we're supposed to sever relationships with employers and notify authorities if we're ever asked to put the public at risk. So that's something, when we think about our day-to-day activities, when we think about what we're doing out there, rarely does it come up, but when it does come up, when we have to make a decision that maybe puts the public at risk, maybe our employer is asking us to, compromise on an analysis, we can't do that. And actually, we're supposed to sever our employment. That's a strong thing to say, and that's our requirement. I represent professional engineers in front of the board, and I've gone through not this specific issue, but many others where the board looks at things very black and white. If you don't follow the board's rules, they will find you in violation and cite you and fine you and discipline you. They do not tolerate fools over the board. The other thing we must do is make public statements that are honest and true. We need to disclose who are we representing. We must not give no opinion that is not based on our technical expertise. So when we're out there in public meetings, when we're out there writing articles, when we're out there doing research and making that available to folks, it needs to be within our expertise, and we need to make sure that it is honest and true. We have to avoid conflicts of interest. We have to consciously avoid conflicts of interest. But then the code said, but when unavoidable, disclose any conflicts to the employer and the client, and then don't accept money if it's the same project for the same work. Now, this disclosure is interesting to me, and because I've dealt with it a lot in my career. When I was at the department, I actually sat on the conflict of interest board, and we would look at situations where consultants would come to us and say, hey, I've done work for you, ODOT, but I want to work perhaps with a design build contractor. Is that okay? Most of the times it's not, but sometimes it was. Sometimes it was perfectly fine. And then ODOT or any other government entity or any private entity would then release the person from the conflict, where they release the engineer from the conflict. The conflict is owned by the owner, and the owner can choose to release the conflict. There may be a very valid reason why the owner is willing to accept some conflict, some risk, to get a better product for them. So the conflict of interest is something that we have to consciously avoid, but the best part of that is we need to disclose it and then have a dialogue about it, and then whatever the owner decides is how we have to follow the rules. And then we cannot solicit for employment, right? We can't go misrepresent our competencies. We can't go tell people if they give me this job, we'll give you a slice of it. We can't pay to get a job. Simple as that. I'm taking a pause here because I want you, as I've asked you to, think about these different rules, reducing them to something we can discuss and understand. Because as we go through these different philosophers, I'm going to get to in a few minutes, as we go through the different cultures, we'll see how our rules are very similar to what people have been teaching for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And perhaps that is how I would suggest how we came up with our rules, by these different evolutions of philosophers and different amalgamations of societal ethics. The last group of 3 is improper conduct. Don't plan stamp. Don't stamp someone's plans that you didn't have proper supervisory control. And you need to disclose violations of any code section to the board. I've actually dealt with this in my career as a representing professional engineers. The allegation that someone improperly didn't properly supervise a person and went ahead and stamped the plans of someone that they weren't in appropriate control over. And then similarly, I've had a circumstance where a person was accused of changing plans, and the change from our perspective as the engineer that I represent was so de minimis, it didn't matter, it didn't impact the plans. But then another perspective is, hey, once these plans are stamped, they're supposed to be immutable. Part of actually what I'm trying to do, work I'm hoping to do sometime this summer, is on electronic delivery of plans, having them, in essence, making them electronically part of a contract. And those sets of plans will necessarily need to be completely unchangeable. Immutable is the term that's used. Unchangeable plans means that once they're done and they're stamped, thou shalt not change them again. You can have new plans, but you can't ever change these plans. So under the same concept, the person who goes in there maybe just makes a tweak. Maybe the client asks them to change this, add this, whatever, to detract from this, take this away. That's a change. And if we make them in an electronic world, that change, we will never be able to make those changes. But it's not hard to make those changes on paper. And the board wants to make sure that those don't happen, certainly not improperly. Other jurisdictions, 08, also I represent engineers from other states. They want to practice in Ohio. If they aren't properly licensed, they can get cited. If they're cited in Ohio, they need to disclose that if they're licensed in other jurisdictions. It is a pain in the patoot, but it happens. And when it happens, you have to fully disclose it, or you will get disciplined in those other jurisdictions. And the last one's record. Retain your records for today that you went through the training today. Retain your records that you had your other training, and also retain your records so that the board, when they ever do an audit for you, and I've had one done for me, it's not a big deal, can show that you are properly working within the products and your capacity, making sure that if you do have a set of plans that are on file somewhere, that you have records of that. So you retain your records for the board. So we can divide these 4 ethical concepts into basically 4 broad categories. The first one, obligations to the public. Obviously, we covered a lot of those. And this is, we're saying, and I would suggest to you that our code section says obligation to the public is number 1, it is paramount. The obligation to but the question I guess we would think about is, who is the public? Is it just the persons who are impacted by our immediate work? People who are going to be impacted by our future work, or citizens across the state or continents? Keep in mind that we have an obligation to them all, because whatever work we do, if it's in the public domain, we have to be honest and true, and we have to be accurate in what we do. Put their interests first. We have an obligation to the employer or the client. We're supposed to be faithful agents, remember? Faithful agents to the employer, faithful agents to the public. Maintain confidentiality where appropriate, and avoid conflicts of interest. We have obligations to other engineers, obligations to the profession, right? We make sure that we supervise and control the engineers who are underneath us. We need to make sure that we provide for their opportunities for professional development. I find very else in my professional career more satisfying than having a mentee come to me years later and show me the appreciation for my helping them over the years. And then we have an obligation to the profession. Make sure we're doing what we do here, share our knowledge, share our information, make sure that we keep the profession in high regard, and participate as we can in professional organizations. So that's our group of requirements for engineering ethics. Let's talk in now much more broad terms and talk about ethics in general. We're going to talk about 3 Greeks, 2 Englishmen, a few people from Asia, and 2 Germans. We're going to get into the philosophical ideals of these great thinkers. These people, and there are so many more. It's obviously I couldn't put a presentation together that included all the great thinkers of history. But these guys, I think they're relevant. I've talked about Aristotle in the past. I've talked about a few of these other folks in some of my presentations, and they're interesting histories. They're interesting people, but they've had significant influence on all parts of society. So looking at the slide itself, on the left-hand side, you have people who have influenced Western society, Western ethics a great deal. On the bottom right, you see folks, a few philosophers that have impacted Asian ethics a great deal. And we're going to see when we get to them how those two philosophers and their teachings of philosophy are directly impactful of the engineering ethics in writing for professional engineers in their parts of the world. So the first person to talk about is Socrates. Socrates, one of his most primary ideals is to pursue wisdom, to pursue thought, and to engage in the Socratic method. And the Socratic method is basically a question and answer. It's a do loop of thought, a do loop of challenging your beliefs. He felt like if you could ask questions about everything in your life, you'd be a wiser person. You could get more information from people, challenge people on their deeper understandings of their beliefs as well. I believe his mission from God was to basically teach folks to be better people so they could be healthier humans, whether it's in their minds, their bodies, or their souls. Obviously emphasized virtue in the culture and living life in accordance with understanding of what is good. So Socrates is very much, again, the pursuit of wisdom and the pursuit of challenging one's own thoughts and thinking of and overthinking and communicating and having dialogue with people. Aristotle was a student of Socrates. Aristotle was, I think it was like 12 or 13 years old when he first learned from Socrates, and he created this concept of virtue ethics. I've done a whole presentation on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It was a book that he wrote. He wrote many, many treatises. The Nicomachean Ethics talked about how to live well, how to pursue a good life, and how to seek the golden mean between vices and virtues, between excess and deficiency. Seeking that golden mean, according to Aristotle, is the best pursuit of happiness and a way to be happy. So he has all kinds of quotes, and you can look them up, and there's many, many, many more than this, but I find this to be interesting. And the first one is especially interesting because this is why we're here. We want to be ethical. We want to be ethical, and we want to embrace it as part of our lives. You can't just make a choice one day and wake up and say, I'm going to be ethical, and then go to sleep and think you're going to be ethical. You have to pursue it. You have to make it a habit. So if we pursue something and we do something repeatedly, we can be excellent at it. And then that includes being having ethics and being ethical. He said all kinds of other quotes, and I'll let you go ahead and read them for yourself. But he was also always worried about the pursuit of good, the pursuit of happiness, and the pursuit of this golden mean in people's lives. A contemporary of Aristotle was Plato. They both taught at the Lyceum in Athens, Greece. And he believed, among other things, that reality is an imperfect reflection of the perfect ideal. He called that the forms. And Plato's also written many treatises, and I may actually try to do a sort of a presentation on Plato in years in the future. But he taught him his pursuit of, or his knowledge of the imperfect life also involves the need to continue to try to pursue perfection. And you do that by being a good person, by trying to have a perfect health, by trying to have a perfect mind, recognizing that it could never be perfect, but the goal is always to try and to pursue that perfection. Always try to be better, always try to educate yourself, always try to live a happier life. If you do those things, if you recognize that we're all imperfect, but we can always pursue some level of perfection, never probably get there, but pursue it, that will be the ideal life. And that way you will be happy and a better person, and obviously a more ethical person for it. Jumping to our English philosophers, John Locke, and we'll talk about him real quick. John Locke was an English philosopher, and he had the idea of this social contract, natural rights theory. His teachings were some of his teachings were what we based our U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence on. So he thought that the government was obviously to be consent. Government was based on the consent of the governed. Again, he talked about a social contract. But when we think about these things, those are our rules. So thinking back, I shared with you that we're under the rules. We have a social contract, in essence, with professional engineers and surveyors board we keep our license as long as we follow their rules. And those rules are created by the people who govern us. They're created by the General Assembly, and the General Assembly was elected by us. So in a very real way, this comes full circle that we have consented to be regulated in this way, the way we are. Adam Smith wrote several also treatises. One of the most famous one from him is The Wealth of Nations. And what he says that individuals who pursue their self-interest in a free market are led by what he called an invisible hand. He felt that this invisible hand, this unseen pressure of good and healthy competition to pursue profits was a good thing. Basically, he indicated that there's a division of labor in society. Certain people have certain skills. Those people who have, like us, professional engineers, should pursue those skills. And going after profits was never a bad thing, because we want to compete fairly with each other. And we can look across the aisle and say, I want to work with you because I know you're competing fairly against me, but not really in a negative way, but in a positive way. So he felt competition was good. And he felt that people who are in their own basically skill set should always try to excel to the highest level of that skill set. But once you're in there, be the best you can be. Switching over continents, we're looking at the philosopher, Lao Tzu. He came up with a theory of Taoism. Now, when you think about Asian societies, one of the things we'll get to when we read the Engineer's Ethics for Japanese Engineers is that humans and animals should live in a balance with the Tao and a balance with the universe. Not dissimilarly, Confucius talked about similar things. He also felt that social harmony was very important. He talked that valuing education and learning, cultivating virtue and understanding was very important. Not dissimilar from other Western societies. And again, the value of education, we saw that reflected in Aristotle's teachings as well. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher. He emphasized the individual achievement as creating the means of meaning in life. And he also rejected absolute truths. And that's going to be important when we get into sort of more modern analysis of ethics, that there is malleability in today's ethical analysis of these absolutes. He also believed in the will of people to have personal drive and to overcome obstacles. He felt that was very, very valuable and a very ethical thing to do. When we think about that in our context, we all overcame the obstacles of getting our licenses. Wasn't an easy thing. It was very hard for me. So these things he felt were very ethical. We should be proud of them and elevate them in our societies. Now, closing with the philosophers with Karl Marx. I wanted to share some of his thoughts with you to show that not every person and not every philosopher who talked about ethics over the history of time, I would agree with or would say that they're consistent with what we want to promote as ethical engineers. But I'm going to also share a little bit of a nuanced perspective on that. Karl Marx talked about classism and the conflicts of class being the driving force for social change. I don't think that's right. I think it's actually people who embrace each other and consider their melting pot of ideas would be a better way, not necessarily class conflict. But I also talked about, in essence, putting others before you. I forget his exact quote, but in essence, it says, if you can do to each by their skill, to others by their need, or something like that. In a way, we do that as engineers because we put the public first. We use our skill to protect people in the public realm that maybe don't have the skills that we have. So I don't say necessarily that engineers are Marxists, but it's an interesting way to sort of think about, is this what he was talking about, and how we got there, maybe not all the way, but in a different way, putting others' needs in front of our own as professional engineers. Now, currently, there are many currents in society driving change. In our most immediate society right now, these are the hot topics that I found when I did my research. There's a push for prioritizing the environment. But we saw that, right? I mean, like I said, this is what's driving social change, driving societal ethics now. But Taoism has been around for thousands of years, talking about prioritizing the environment. Number two, there's a response to people's needs for a general lack of time, right? We're always recognizing that we never have enough time to do things. There's a response of need for that, for more immediate. And I know I do that in my own practice. I try to do my best. I feel like I'm a better lawyer by responding to my clients quickly. The malleability of ethics is real in our world. There's a gravitation away from absolutisms, and that is actually a direct result, a direct corollary to the teachings of Nietzsche, this lack of absolutisms. And also we see that in our society just today, right? I don't want to be too controversial, but something that's a very hot topic, and we see it every day in the newspaper, so it's nothing new, is this whole concept of, men feeling like they're women and women feeling like they're men. The trans movement is definitely a gravitation away from absolutism. Lots of folks don't believe they're absolutely male or absolutely female anymore. You don't have to absolutely have a gender. I'm not going to comment on it whether I like it or believe it or not, but the point is, that is what's going on in society. Those are discussions that are happening in society. And then number four, there's interest in being perceived as responsive to these types of changes. So giving our example about gender, people often now are putting the references to their gender in their email. That's why I see emails from folks that say she and her, or they and their. This is a need to be responsive and perceived to be responsive to this societal pressure. So we see that trend in society as well, and this affect and impact our ethics. We also see trends in populism and nationalism. Those are directly out of the teachings of John Locke. We have right now, like in Merhedem, President of the United States, who is very much a populist and nationalist. And we saw recently in Poland, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, there was an election, a populist president got elected. You could also say in the Canadian election of their president, the prime minister, was definitely a result of their nationalism, because they were actually, I think, voting against the comments of our president. So the Canadians voted for Canada and in a way against the United States for Canadian nationalism. So these are trends in our society. These things drive societal change, and change isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is what it is. There's a fun little saying, every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. It is what it is. Society does change. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but how we respond to change, how we adopt it, how we reject it, how we deal with it, that goes to our own ethics. And as we've seen while the different philosophers that I shared with you, their ideals and philosophies changed, so does change the philosophies and ideals and ethics of the generations. So again, we've had these discussions before. I'm sure you have in your HR classes or whatever, talking about the different generations. These are the 5 general generations that are considered in the workforce right now. The silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and obviously the youngest generation, Gen Z and onward. I don't know. I'm sure there's already a term for the next generation after that. But we deal with these folks, and we have to understand, as we deal with them in our own culture and in our own profession as engineers, they have different perspectives on things. And they have, because of their different perspectives, because of how they grow up, because of what they've seen in their lives, in their world, they have a different ethical analysis, a different way of looking at ethics. We just need to be cognizant of that. So when we work together, it is important to embrace these differences and these nuances. It's better for us. It's better for our employer. It's better for our constituents, for the public, for our clients. If we embrace and understand the differences in our generations, we can be better by embracing these differences and working together and understanding the generational ethics in the different work culture. So here's the first one. The first one is the dedicated or silent generation. They're born between 1928 and 1945. As you can imagine, their work ethic is basically put your head down and do your work. They respect authority. They appreciate authority. In other words, they want to go into a job and know who the boss is, but they don't necessarily have to deal with the boss unless they are the boss. And if they are the boss, they expect to be respected. These people are still in the workforce. My mother is 83 years old and she still goes to work 4 days a week. So not only is they working, but they have a significant influence on society by what they consume. So this is the silent generation. The next one are the children of the silent generation, the baby boomers. They're considered driven. They come from a world where, as they grow up, the economy was thriving, opportunities were booming. But this is the first generation where you saw people in careers that came from, I would say, marginalized from the previous generation. So we see women and minorities much more in this generation coming in, getting degrees, working and getting into positions of authority. This is the first generation that really delved into that really evolved into that. They also have a deep respect for work. They also have an unusual respect for qualifications and credentials. They like authority in some ways, but they also hate it. They are the first generation to rebel. So again, thinking about how these folks in these different generations have grown up, what their beliefs are, what their ethical paradigms are, allows us to be more effective in dealing with them and getting the best out of them and giving them the best we can give them as our bosses, for instance. Generation X, my generation, born between 1965 and 1980. They can also consider the skeptical generation. We have a positive work ethic. We want to balance our lives, though, with work. Lots of folks like me were people who's the first generation that both parents worked. Lots of folks also were the first generation where parents got divorced. It became a much more acceptable thing than previous generations. So people in my generation, we want a work-life balance. We want to basically, get our credentials. We want respect. We also want to be competent. We want to be perceived as competent, and we only really want to work for competent leaders. So as previous generations, if you were the boss, you work for the boss, no matter how competent the boss was. This generation, the skeptical generation, will question, will challenge the boss a little bit more. The next generation of the determined millennials. They want to work. They also, again, even want to have a more work-life balance. They're very driven. They're very determined. They want to excel. They want to speak up and have conversations about things. They want to share their beliefs with you. They want to share what's important with you. They want to collaborate much more than previous generations. They like helping each other. They like working collectively, and they can multitask better than previous generations as well. They're also very tech savvy, but not quite as tech savvy as the next generation, Gen Z. This generation is considered very optimistic, but they're in the workforce right now, or they're consuming things right now. They're born between 1997 and 2012. I guess, 2012 would be a 13-year-old, maybe working in a convenience store or delivering newspapers or whatever. Heck, who knows? Maybe they have some type of online job that they do, work that they do. This group is very open-minded. They appreciate feedback, immediate feedback. They're a very creative generation. And they also look for rewards. Just thinking about this, they're the first generation that likes. They want to be liked and they want to get likes. They want to have a flexible lifestyle, even much more so than previous generations. And again, they like face-to-face communication. It may be that this is the generation that grew up, under COVID. And so they have a great value in working face-to-face. They have a great value in working where their input is valued. So when we look a lot across these different generations, we see that they have different ethical expectations. We see that, for instance, in reporting misconduct, the younger generations are much more likely to report unethical behavior than the older generations. The older generations are more hesitant because they feel that part of their morality is being loyal to the company. The generations have a different work-life balance. And then, so as you can see how that would be, if you're one of the older generations, maybe you feel it's more important to come to work than the younger generations. You can see how there could be conflict between those two. There also is this whole concept of transparency in the communications. Again, the older generations don't communicate as effectively or aren't even interested in it or don't feel like it's part of their values and morality than the younger generations who value it greatly. And it's part of their self-worth. And then social responsibility. Generally, again, these are all trends, these are all generalities, but generally younger generations are more vocal about social responsibility, and they want their job to align with their social values much more than previous generations did. How do we manage it? How do we deal with them? That's all well and good, Tom, but how do we deal with these folks? Well, studies have shown that ways to deal with these different generations to be open in your communication, to involve them in education and training, create lots of those opportunities and show that you value their education and being trained. Have leaders that are aware of these differences, be mindful of these differences, understand and feel free to discuss these differences, and then basically embrace diversity of thought, encourage collaboration between the different generations. That gets the most out of them, and that's how to effectively manage them. Now, this one author put forth this ethical dilemma. I know it's a lot to read. I'll summarize it real quick. This author said, look, to have a healthy society, to embrace all these different generational ideas, you must promote diversity of beliefs, promote excellence in all areas of life, reject mindsets or perspectives that devolve society, that result in any violence, actively engage in ethical behavior at all levels, and then recognize that, hey, life is not always certain, and that's okay. Share those information, share this ideal, look at these things from this perspective, and we'll be able to overcome this ethical dilemma. There are different ethics and cultures, and I want to share those with you as we're getting towards the last 20 minutes of our time. These are the 4 cultures that I picked out. There are probably many more. Well, then these are the ones I wanted to talk about today. First of all, North America, US and Canada, we have our code of ethics. It's no secret. We have our professional engineers and surveyors board code of ethical requirements for the law. We have NSPE, ASCE, ACEC. There's probably 100 different groups in the United States and Canada. But this is the one from the ACEC, and I wanted to share this with you. And I pointed out a couple things in their codes of ethics that I think are relevant to the discussion today. Obviously, first and foremost, they put the health, safety, and welfare of the public first. That's consistent through all of these codes of ethics. ACEC also says that you need to express, or excuse me, ASCE says you need to express your professional opinions truthfully, again, consistent with Ohio. Zero tolerance for corruption, consistent with Ohio. And then, in essence, report misconduct. So you see that in these codes of ethics, they're quite similar to what we've seen in Ohio's. Yeah. Then Engineers of Canada, it's the largest group in Canada that regulates engineers, and this is the group that regulates all engineers. So for instance, here in the United States, we more or less have 50 different regulatory arms, and every state has a little bit of different regulations of their engineers. Engineers Canada, and then again, in the 50 states, each state provides licensures. That's not so in Canada. Engineers Canada basically controls all the licensures for the entire 300,000 plus members. And this is their code of ethics, and I highlighted in yellow the things that I thought were similar directly to those we've talked about in the United States. So again, health, safety, and welfare of the public is paramount. Only talk in areas of your competence. You're a faithful agent. You have integrity. You report ethical behavior. You pursue things with honor and dignity. But the 2 under highlighted in blue are a little different. And as we can imagine, Canada has maybe a little bit different influences than the United States in all the things they do, and it's reflected here in their code of ethics. They want to treat, number 9, treat equitably and promote equitable, dignified treatment of people in accordance with their human rights legislation, and be societally and environmentally aware of your decision making. Again, different than we saw certainly in Ohio. Now in Europe, we have the European Union, and that sort of coalesces many different areas in Europe, and these are sort of their primary things that the EU's core values are. And I'm not going to get into it, but you can do your own research and see how they talk about this different ethics in medicine and society and technology and standards of governance. But at Engineers Europe, this is a group that does similar to Engineers Canada, regulates licensures of engineers and has their own sets of standards. There are, I guess, about 6 million professional engineers belong to Engineers Europe. It's been around for almost 75 years, this group. And they do peer review applications, and they're the ones that you would talk to in Europe to be certified. But they have their own, as you can imagine, code of ethics. And again, similarly, I highlighted in yellow what I thought was similar to what we have here in North America. You should only undertake tasks for which you have demonstrated competency. As a professional engineer, don't misrepresent things, don't lie about your education. Be impartial, avoid conflicts of interest. Again, point blank, the same as us. The last one, challenge unethical behavior when observed. It's a little different, right? Because they're saying you should challenge unethical behavior when it's observed. And ours, I think we're only required to disclose it. It's a little different. And then the blue is definitely different. They're worried about, and they want you to prevent and avoid adverse impacts on the environment. We don't do that. We don't make that a priority, at least on our, not that it's good, not that it's bad, but it's not in, for instance, Ohio's rules for ethical engineers. Respect personal rights of people with whom they work. Respect their cultural differences in society, and be prepared to contribute to the public debate. Now, the first two in blue are definitely different. The last one, it says be prepared to contribute to the public debate on matters that are important in the field. I would say, obviously, we're saying you shouldn't speak unless you're competent, but this one says be prepared to contribute to the public debate. I think that was something we should consider, at least it's in Ohio, is asking, our engineers and surveyors in the state to contribute more, make that part of our, not necessarily requirements, but something that we should promote. Asia, a little bit differently. In Asia, it's interesting because they have such deep, different cultural roots, have been going on for thousands of years, that they're being forced just because of the economies in their different cultures to really quickly advance and either embrace or understand their cultural differences. So there's definitely deep traditional ethical values in Asia, and they're being constantly confronted with those changes across the pond, across the Pacific Ocean here in the United States, and Western values, because we're driving so much of the economy, and we deal with engineers from those countries all the time. So many folks come over from the Asian continent to work for us, with us. We work remotely with them. That is definitely an amalgamation of the different values from Asia and being impacted strongly by the United States. Now, there's probably engineers ethics for India and China and South Korea, whatever. I found this one from Japan that's easily to find. This was even more starkly different. They have, they say you shall, as a civil engineer, contribute to society. You shall respect nature, and I'll harken that back to Confucius and Taoism. You shall ensure that the security of society to mitigate disasters. You fulfill your professional responsibilities. Like, that's a thing, you must do it. But then, similarly, they say guard integrity, avoid conflicts of interest, verbatim for our ethics in Ohio. Openly provide information, engage in public dialogue. It's similar, worded differently, but it's the similar concept of when you engage in public dialogue, you need to make sure that the information you're providing is accurate. This I thought was interesting. Number 7, make known the results of your research endeavors. So share your knowledge with people. I think it's a good thing. I don't know that we really have that in our code of ethics. Strive for self-improvement. Again, right? That's what we're doing here. We're getting trained in ethics. We're constantly striving for self-improvement. So I thought that was similar. That's why I highlighted in yellow. And then comply with established norms. A different way of phrasing it. Comply with established norms is basically follow the laws, follow the rules, follow the regulations. It's the same thing, just phrased in maybe a different way. The last cultural group I'll share is the Middle East. The research I did indicated that Middle Eastern ethics are really influenced by religion still, deeply influenced by Judaism, deeply influenced by Islamism. Their ethical frameworks are therefore created around their religious ideals. There's much less separation of church and state, for example, when you go and deal with Middle Eastern countries. There's a strong emphasis on family and elders, and also personal integrity and reputation. So if you could think about maybe the highlights for Middle Eastern ethics, I didn't find anything for like ethics in Israel or ethics in Saudi Arabia or whatever, but these are the general examples of their ethical considerations. They are, in essence, modest. They are modest in their dress. I mean, again, these are generalities when we talk about people over in those different cultures. I don't want to sound too stereotypical, but kind of that's what I'm doing. I'm stereotyping to talking about these generalities. But these people in those regions of the world are just generally tend to dress a little more conservatively, a little more modestly. They also are very observant of the dietary practices, and they feel that part of their religion is part of their diet. They have a very strong emphasis on family. They feel like the family is the foundation of society, and that these things generate and influence how they behave ethically. Business practices definitely vary depending on what part of of Asia that you're in, the Middle East that you're in. And then human rights, they recognize human rights, but there's actually a lot of struggle on human rights going on right now in the region. So these are, the cultural differences that we need to be considerate of when we deal with folks from these different areas, which are much more, because we're in the United States, much more part of our lives now than perhaps ever they were before. These are our coworkers, oftentimes. Understand that there are cultural and ethical differences between the people we work with, and respect that. Respect that they have different concepts of morality. You don't have to embrace them, just have to understand that that's different. That there's different cultural ethics, and sometimes that stimulates how they make a decision and how they look at things through their prism of life. For instance, in some societies, it's even acceptable to exchange money under the table, or in others, it's completely illegal. And then, for instance, some societies, women are still not allowed to drive. So these are things that happen in these other parts of the world. And when we deal across continents, across the world, across the globe with these folks in real time for our work, it's important to understand them. It's better to understand how they look at things, look at life, and look at their own ethical requirements. Now, these are the factors that contribute to these cultural ethical differences, right? Social institutions, customs and traditions, again, the history of each culture. They all have their unique customs, their beliefs and values, again, thinking about the Middle East, how Judaism and Islamism really impacts their decision-making and influences their behavior, and then their communication. Also, these different cultures communicate differently. They shake hands differently. They look at your eye and across the table, and they communicate with you differently. Understand those, embrace those in your workplace and as your clients, and you'll basically be a more ethical engineer because of that. And this is the last thing I wanted to share with you, is the Code of Ethics from ASCE and how that has evolved and changed, over time. And what ASCE is now emphasizing that's important. In their Code of Ethics, one of their paradigms is the natural built environment, something that engineers need to be concerned with. Even their preamble indicates that engineers need to create a resilient and sustainable infrastructure, different than the past. Changes from the past, things that ideals that have been evolved and evolved from other cultures, from other belief systems. They tell, even in the preamble, treat all persons with respect, dignity, and fairness in a manner that fosters equitable participation without regard to personal identity. Again, a modern idea that's being promoted in American Society of Civil Engineers ethical preamble. This chart was put together by Ben Walpole when ASCE came up with their new rules and new ethical codes in 2020. And I've highlighted these sections to show these are more ideals that can be directly tied to different cultures and different ethical perspectives and philosophies of the philosophers that we talked about. So inclusivity, again, a modern concept. Professional development, something that Aristotle would say is very important. Avoid conflicts of interest. Remember, we talked about Adam Smith. He said fair competition is a very ethical and important thing. Sustainability, I would say, is more tied toward Eastern philosophy, worrying more about nature and bringing that as part of our ethics. And lastly, knowledge sharing knowledge with everyone. It was an Eastern value, it's a Western value, it's a good thing for everyone. So I'm going to summarize and conclude, and we'll have some opportunities for questions at the end. Ethical philosophies, as we've seen over time in cultures, different parts of the world, they ebb and flow based on history, based on location, based on even within each generation. Be cognizant of that and embrace that difference, and you'll be better for it, and your work will be better for it, and ultimately the work product and your clients will be better served by it. Engineering ethics is applied professional ethics. So those of us who are in a profession, we have ethics and we apply it to our profession. It's a system of our moral principles, and it's new, right? It's only been around, studied since about the 70s, and it deals with character, conduct, ideals, relationship. And most importantly, maybe, is that last term, technical development, technological development. Technological development and ethics in AI is a whole probably day or week-long course in and of itself. What's going on? Who's programming artificial intelligence right now to be ethical? And how is that being determined? And what philosophies, backgrounds, cultures are going into that programming that we're all going to be subject to in very short order if we aren't already? And lastly, regardless of when, where, who, an ethical engineer is always things, right? Think about the philosophies that we talked about. Think about the different societies, Asian, Middle East, European. There's a lot of similarities, but we're always professionals. We always have integrity, and engineers always place the public interest above their own. Do that, and you'll always be an ethical engineer. Thank you, and I think I have some time for some questions.
Thanks, Tom. And as a reminder to our audience, the questions box is available, so please feel free to type in any questions. And Tom, we did have our first question from Clark, and I've copied that question into the chat section.
Okay. So you would like me to read it, Mike?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Clark says, do you agree that 20 years ago, a situation that was legal but appeared unethical, engineering would avoid the situation, while today the only concern is legal, no matter if it appears ethical or not? All right, I'm gonna have to think about that, Clark. Do I agree that 20 years ago, a situation that was legal but appears unethical, oops, disappeared, hold on a second. A little challenging, I got a really small screen on this. Appears unethical, engineers would avoid it, while today the only concern is legal, no matter if it appears ethical or not. No, I will disagree with that, Clark. I think I understand what you're saying. And I would say, while the legal concern is probably the most immediately impactful, the ethical concern gets to your reputation. And so I would say engineers still are very concerned, and they should be concerned about their reputation. And so they will also try to actively avoid unethical situations, even though they may not think they may recognize that there's not illegal. That's because we're all here, trying to do a job and trying to do a good job and looking for the next job. And if you consider it an unethical person, whether you're legal or not, people aren't going to want to work with you. And there's actually research I've done on that topic as well. Question from Darren: with all of the different generations currently in the workforce, right? There's 5. Is there a presentation that provides real-world conflicts between the generations within the workforce and how they were resolved? Yeah. So I mean, I have to say promote Google, but you could Google it, and you'll find that there's actually what you want to call it, like scenarios that people have generated between the different generations and talked about how they look at things differently, and then explain how a person from Gen Z would react and Gen X or Gen Y or whatever would react. They're out there. I don't have them at the tip of my fingers, but yes, there's actually information out there. But I just stumbled across. I can't point you to who did the research, but when I did my research, I do remember seeing scenarios like that, and it's interesting. It might be a good idea for another presentation. All right,
thanks,
that's
Tom.
all I see.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Question from Rebecca. Is there any estimate about what percentage of software engineers working on AI are licensed as PEs?
I've never seen it. I would submit probably not very many. And therein lies an interesting paradigm or question you just put out there. I don't know if you intended to ask it or not, but if I'm an engineer and I get, maybe I go through undergraduate in computer science engineering, and maybe I take one ethics class, but because I don't have a professional license, I'm no longer required to have any continuing education. My ethical teachings end there. So unless my employer or someone else, talks about it. So I think you're making an interesting point that I would submit to you, those people in the software engineering world probably don't pursue professional licenses that much, just because it's not as indicative in their society as like those of us who are civil, and therefore they probably aren't trained and repeatedly trained as much as they otherwise should be, and they're the ones programming the AI. So it's a really interesting point you bring up.
Thanks, Tom. We have a question from June. You talked about generalization or stereotypes in the presentation. In your years of
Yes.
engineering practice, what are some of the ways you helped check yourself to not push unnecessary value judgments in the name of ethics?
Good question, and I think it is it's training, right? And those of us who are employed by employers who provide training, to be a lot of the training that I've gone through were suggested that I needed to check my own ideas, and I'll use a term that's probably overused, my own privilege. When I deal with my employees, I at one point managed over 30 folks, and sometimes, quite often, I had to make sure that I wasn't artificially infusing my values into their lives and their decisions. So it's an active and conscious thing that you have to do. And if you can get training on it from your employer, it would be helpful.
Thanks, Tom. We have a comment from Kimberly. She says she would argue that reputable engineers, regardless of licensure, would pursue continuing education in their field.
Maybe. I tell you what, I was an engineer for a number of years before they made it mandatory, and I rarely pursued continuing education. But this part of it just wasn't. I think now that it's required, I think obviously we have to do it, and so we do it. But yeah, it's interesting. That's an interesting comment.
All right. Well, we have reached 2 p.m. I want to mention that many of us participate in the Ohio Transportation Engineering Conference, OTEC, each year. And typically there is a session on ethics at OTEC. And I know, Tom, you've been a presenter for many of those sessions. So many of us will be at OTEC in October. And Tom, any final comments before we conclude?
No, just appreciate the opportunity. And, my contact information is on the computer here, my phone number and my email. So if anybody has any further questions, happy to chat, happy to dialogue. And if there's ever a need for me, feel free to give me a call.
All right. Well, we want to thank Tom for presenting today's webinar, and thanks everybody for your participation. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.